Okay, our next session is dealing with some of the implications of the Reformation for real life. We've talked about the theology of the Reformation. We've talked about the authority structures, how you settle theological matters in the context of the Reformation. We talked about how it arose, all of these kinds of things. What difference does this make in practical terms to daily life? Remember, the difference between Luther and the humanists is that Luther is going to argue that all of the abuses in the Catholic Church, which the humanists were after and wanted to correct, the humanists were limited to just dealing with the abuses. Luther wanted to argue that the abuses were an outgrowth of wrong theology. And he argued that a change in theology should result in a change in the church, and with it, changes in society as well. So what we want to do now is to take a look at what some of the practical implications, what this looks like on the ground, and how Luther's ideas helped shape a different view of vocation and culture. Now, I want to start with the idea of vocation. The word vocation, of course, comes from the Latin vocare, meaning a call, to call. Your vocation is your calling. We tend to associate in English the word vocation with job. Your vocation is whatever you are employed at. And that is actually anchored very deeply in the Protestant tradition, as we'll see in a minute. But the essential idea is that your vocation is a calling, and specifically a calling from God to do something. In the Catholic Church, the concept of vocation is limited to the clergy. The only people who have a vocation, who have a calling, are people who are entering the clergy. Priests, monks, friars, nuns, sisters. That's it. Those are the only people with a true calling. Because the only thing that God calls people to do is to serve the church. Or to serve in the church, to be members of the clergy. The secular world is in many ways divorced from these ideas of calling. Now, part of this has to do with the way the Catholics conceive of the clergy, what the role they have is. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, why Luther rejects holy orders as one of the sacraments. There are, within Catholicism, you have this concept called orders. These are types of service within the church and sometimes specific subgroups. So you've got the order of the priesthood, you've got orders of deacons, you have a variety of orders of that sort. And then you also have specific religious orders like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and so on. All of these are installed into their position through the action of a sacrament, according to Catholic theology. That's how you enter into these holy orders. It's why order is plural, and it's why it's a sacrament. The fundamental role of a priest within Catholicism is to act as a mediator between the congregation and God. So the priest is going to, it's a two-way street here. The priest is going to stand between the people and God and represent them in his prayers and even in the context, in some sense, in the context of the sacraments. He is also going to stand between God and the people. That is to say, he's going to be God's spokesman. He is going to be the one who distributes and administers divine grace via the sacraments, and so on. He is the mediator. He's the key figure between humanity and God. That's the essential role of the priest, and that's why priests are, in fact, so central, why the Catholic Church really is, in essence, a clerical organization far more than an organization of laity. It's one of the reasons why modern Catholics, particularly in America, I don't know about Europe, but particularly in America, they don't get the Catholic Church. Because in a country that is built so much on egalitarianism in principle and democracies and things like that, they think that the people should be telling the priests what to do, or the people should have some say in the direction of the church. That's not what Catholicism is about. Catholicism is a hierarchical structure that is fundamentally clerical in its organization and in its focus. Growing up Catholic, I got the sense that the Catholic Church just is. You know, as long as you got the priests, as long as you have the bishops, as long as you have the Pope, as long as you have all of these things in place, the Catholic Church is there. You don't really need the laity. And it's your choice as a layperson whether or not you are going to participate in the benefits that are offered by the church. But frankly, your involvement is largely irrelevant. The church will function very nicely and will continue to function very nicely, completely without the laity, because a priest can go and offer Mass by himself with no one in the audience, and it's still going to convey grace. It's still going to do what it does. So it is at its heart a clerical organization. As it relates to the laity, it is the mediator between God and humanity and vice versa. The sacraments, in particular, that the priest does, they function, the Latin phrase is ex opere operato, which means out of the work that has been done, loosely. What that means is that the engine that drives the sacraments, really at its core, is Christ's death and resurrection. Since that event has already been done, since that is the key event that makes the sacraments function, any ordained priest, anyone who's properly ordained, who celebrates the sacrament, who does it in the correct way, follows the order, the sacrament is going to work. It's going to do what it's supposed to do. The bread and wine will be transformed into the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. It will happen because it depends not on the worthiness of the priest, but on the worthiness of Jesus Christ and his death and his resurrection. Which is why you can have an immoral, uneducated priest performing sacraments, and theologically, it's no problem at all. It may be a pastoral issue, but in theological terms, the miracle is going to happen regardless, if he is duly ordained and if he does it right. So what this means is the quality of your clergy is really fundamentally not that important. The Catholic Church works with or without it. Now, since the Reformation, actually in the wake of the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church has done a huge amount to clean up the problems that existed with the clergy prior to the Reformation. They've been providing good education. They've done a whole lot of things. They've been enforcing the celibacy rule in principle. So, I mean, they've done a lot to improve the quality of the clergy, but in principle, it's not that important for them to actually do that because the clergy can function whether they're moral or not, because it depends not so much on them as on the work of Christ. And the priests as mediators, the key mediation that they do is via the sacraments. Many priests prior to the Reformation didn't even preach. As a matter of fact, the orders like the Dominicans and the Franciscans were created specifically to supply preachers, okay, to the congregations. The regular parish priests didn't. Okay? Now, again, that's changed, but historically that's not really their essential role. Now, Luther's response to this is going to be to argue that this is fundamentally wrong. This entire concept of the priesthood is incorrect. And his justification is 1 Peter 2:9, which points to the idea that all believers are priests. Okay? We are a kingdom of priests to serve God. And this concept of the priesthood of all believers is central to Luther's entire way of understanding both the pastoral role and the concept of vocation. Basically, what Luther says is, Scripture is clear, there's only one God, and there is one mediator between God and man, and that's the man Christ Jesus. That's it. We don't need any other mediators. Priests are not mediators. The only mediator we need is Jesus Christ. And through Jesus, every priest has direct access to God through his mediation, which means we can stand directly before God for ourselves and perform the true role of priests. Because we have no need for any outside mediation. We have direct access to God himself. We don't have to go through another person, except the person of Christ himself, who is God. So what this means then is Luther, because of the, and you cannot underestimate the importance of the priesthood of all believers to Luther and Lutherans. This is an absolutely central notion to their entire concept of what the church is. So what this means is a couple of different things. First of all, it's going to require a change in the notion of vocation. Luther and the Protestants following him, all Protestants pretty much following him, are going to argue that vocation, God's calling, is not limited to just people going into church work. That in fact, all legitimate callings, all legitimate professions can be callings from God. You can't be called to be a thief, okay? But anything that doesn't violate a commandment can be a legitimate calling from God. This is a whole new concept, again, of vocation, because what it does is it says that the sacred activities are not limited to what we do in church. It's not preaching and the sacraments that are the only sacred activities out there. Shoemaking is a sacred activity if you're called to be a cobbler. It doesn't matter what job you are doing because, well, the way I like to explain this is, what does Scripture say Jesus is Lord of? The short answer is all. What isn't included in all? Jesus is Lord of every vocation, every calling, every profession on earth. Therefore, working wholeheartedly in whatever profession you are in, as unto God, not unto man, as Paul puts it, is doing sacred work. All work is rightly understood, all legitimate work, non-criminal enterprises, is legitimately sacred before God, if that is what your calling is. Okay? So that's the first thing. There is, in essence, no sacred secular divide. All of life now is sacred. All of life is sacred. The notion that you've got sacred church work over here and vocational work over here, just sort of secular stuff, doesn't really have a place. I spent some time, after I left Catholicism, I spent some time in a church where the attitude was, if you were really serious about following God, you'd become a missionary. If you were sort of serious, you'd become a pastor. And for anything else, you'd have to be a piker. I mean, just forget it. I never really bought into it, and I didn't quite understand why. It wasn't until later that I really figured it out. But it's fundamentally, even today, we've got this sort of Gnostic notion that there's sacred work and there's secular work. And what Luther says and what traditional historic Protestantism says is no, there is no sacred secular divide. Vocation is vocation, and it doesn't matter what it's in. All of it is a calling from God. Now, what does this mean then for pastors? What does this do to the role of pastor? If it's just another job, what does that mean for pastors? And the answer to Luther, from Luther, in essence, is yeah, it's just another job. The pastors are performing an essential function in the community. They've got a specific role in the community. But in a very real sense, they're no more important than your cobblers. And if you have any questions about that, try to imagine northern Germany in the winter without cobblers. Okay. So they perform an important function within the community. They teach catechism, they preach, they administer the sacraments, and all of these are necessary roles fulfilling an important function in human life. But in principle, a pastor is no higher a calling than anything else. As long as you're faithful to whatever God is calling you to do, you're doing sacred work, and that's it. Now, in practice, pastors are actually held in very high regard in Lutheranism, and I have been told that my title in German would be Herr Professor Dr. Sunshine. The only thing that I could get in traditional German society that would be higher than that would be pastor, that less there. So, I mean, in practice, they're held in very high regard. But in principle, in terms of the theology, it's simply a role. It's simply an essential role in the community, but just a role in the community. They're spiritual leaders, they're teachers, all of those kinds of things. But it's no more sacred than any other job. Now, another difference that's going to occur in pastors because of the movement of Lutheranism, and this is less directly connected to the concept of vocation or the priesthood of all believers, is that Luther is going to argue that celibacy is unnecessary. As a matter of fact, we'll go further, not only argue it's unnecessary, but he's going to argue that it's unhelpful for pastors. The reason why Roman Catholic priests are celibate, did you know, by the way, that for longer, that Catholic priests were allowed to marry for more of church history than they have been prohibited from marrying? For the first 1,200 years, if you accept Catholic theory that they go back to St. Peter, for the first 1,200 years or so of church history, priests were allowed to marry. It's only in the 13th century, beginning of the 13th century, that they're banned from marriage. And the reason is there was a desire to improve the quality of the clergy. And at that point, it was believed that monks were the high point of spirituality, and all monks were celibate. So what they wanted to do was improve the quality of the clergy by making them more highly spiritual, making them more like monks, therefore they're not going to be allowed to marry. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, priests still can marry. Luther is going to argue that this is a load of nonsense. It's works righteousness again. So instead, he's going to say, look, marriage is something that's good, that was instituted by God. Are there people called to be celibate? Yeah. Luther thought he was one of them, until Catherine von Bora convinced him otherwise. And therein lies a tale that I wish I had time to tell you. But Luther, in the end, argues, and I quote here, marriage is the most religious state. Because he believed that in a married state, there were more things that you can learn about God, and there's more opportunity to grow in godliness than there is as a single. So Luther is going to think very highly of marriage, and marriage is going to become, in fact, the norm among Protestant ministers. Calvin, in fact, tried to be celibate himself until Martin Butzer told him, you have to get married because we don't believe in celibate clergy. And if you stay single, people will think you do. So there's actually pressure to Protestant ministers to marry. But this becomes considered sort of the norm within society. All ministers, all people should be married and should be in a household. It's going to create a very pro-family, if you will, orientation within the Protestant churches. Marriage becomes the norm in the society. And further, there's a great deal of emphasis on the idea that the father is actually the pastor, the first pastor, the primary pastor in his own household. It was considered very, very important for the fathers to learn the catechism, to learn at the very least, the catechism, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments. Those are the critical things. Actually, Lord's Prayer and Ten Commandments first, then the catechism. And to teach these to their kids. Parents were encouraged to run family devotions, to read the Bible to their family, to do all of these kinds of things, acting as a minister within their own household. Again, remember, the pastorate is not the priesthood. It is a specific role within the society as the whole. Within the small society of the family, that job was seen as belonging properly to the father as the head of the household. So you create a new vision of society. Within Catholicism, Catholicism is built around the concept that, yes, you have family. You have families within the community. But the church itself is a clerical organization, and it is a clerical organization made up of people who are celibate. And so you have the focus being really on celibacy as a religious matter, and the rest of the community being married. There's a sharp cleavage between the two, and there's the sense that a celibate life is a good and acceptable and proper vocation. Within Protestantism, that largely falls away. The idea of singleness becomes kind of out within the Protestant world. Beyond that, you have this broader concept that goes back to the idea of the priesthood of all believers in vocation, and this is the idea of the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate, which really grows out of Genesis 1 and 2, the cultural mandate says that God put us on this earth to build culture, to create culture. The Bible starts in a garden, but it ends in a city. We're supposed to be building culture. We're supposed to be building civilization. We're supposed to be taking the world that God gave us and developing it. The process of creation in Genesis is God starts the world without form and void, shapes it, and then puts man here at the end and says, all right, I'm giving you authority over the world. I'm giving you dominion. Tend the garden, meaning, among other things, build culture. Tend the garden, develop what's here further, bring it. So we're actually continuing the work of forming the creation. This is the concept in Genesis 1 and 2. Of course, it gets interrupted and messed up considerably in Genesis 3. But the idea is that with Christ and with redemption, the effects of the fall are removed and are mitigated, and our original calling in the garden is restored. And we are now here to build culture under the lordship of Christ. Our confession is Jesus is Lord, which means Caesar is not. We need to build a culture under the lordship of Christ in obedience to him, in carrying out the sacred work of whatever it is our vocation is in this world. And all of this is part of God's purpose and his plan for humanity, and part of the intention of the church.